Walter Grady moved through Brooklyn like wind through an alley, seen by few, remembered by none. He had long since become part of the backdrop, his presence no more noticed than the faded posters peeling from brick walls or the rusted scaffolding that never seemed to come down. At 66, his back hunched not just from age but from the years that clung to him like soaked wool. His beard, once regulation trimmed and dark, had grown silver and wild, a weathered banner of a life once disciplined and full of purpose. The old military backpack slung over his shoulder had stories of its own, faded green canvas with straps rubbed threadbare by years of wear. That pack had seen deserts and mountains, convoys and airstrips, and now it rode with him through the streets of a city that didn't remember his name. Walter didn't ask for money. He didn't shout. He didn't disturb. His life had been whittled down to quiet routines, collecting bottles along the avenue, exchanging them for coins at the redemption machines, nodding at the few shopkeepers who let him pass without a scowl. He rotated doorways to sleep in, never staying too long, always mindful not to bring trouble to anyone else's doorstep. To the passers-by, he was simply another homeless man. Another quiet soul occupying the invisible layer of society, slipping between moments, surviving in the gaps. What they didn't see were the medals stored in the bottom of that backpack, wrapped in an old shirt, the Bronze Star, the Combat Action Ribbon, 3 campaign medals. What they didn't hear were the voices that still echoed in his head, the static of radios, the barked commands, the whine of incoming fire. What they didn't know was that Walter had served 22 years in the United States Army. 3 tours. 2 continents. Countless lives changed. Including his own. In 2008, Margaret died. Cancer, they said. Caught too late. A misdiagnosis, buried in bureaucracy, folded into hospital charts and slow-moving paperwork. By the time anyone called it by the right name, it was already everywhere inside her. Walter sat beside her for weeks, watching the light behind her eyes dim. When she passed, something inside him collapsed under its own weight. He sold their modest apartment in Queens, gave the money to her favorite charity, and slipped into the streets like water down a drain. His sisters tried to find him. Old army friends asked around. But Walter didn't want to be found. In his mind, he had failed the only person who truly depended on him. And that failure was too much to carry among familiar faces. Years passed. He grew thinner. His hands grew slower. But he stayed clean. No Dr*GS. No crime. Just a slow slide into anonymity. He found dignity in small rituals, folding his blanket the same way each morning, keeping his boots laced just right, brushing off his coat before entering any store, no matter how broken down. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, he'd think of his old barracks and how the heaters clanked and wheezed all night, and he'd smile, just for a second, at the absurdity of what once seemed miserable. That November afternoon, the sky hung low and sullen. The streets were quiet, save for the scratch of leafless branches against windows and the occasional hiss of a passing bus. Cold settled into the bones early that year. Walter hadn't eaten in nearly 3 days. His fingers were numb, his body light. He moved slower now, each step measured not just by distance but by pain. Hunger was no longer a growl, it was a hollowness behind his eyes. He passed Morelli's Corner Market like he had 100 times before. The windows glowed with warm light. Inside, rows of bread loaves sat untouched, soft and safe. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped in. He didn't want to be seen, but he didn't want to steal. Not really. Not like this. But sometimes the body stops giving a man choices. He waited until the grocer turned to help someone else, then, hand trembling, slid a discounted loaf into the opening of his coat. The action was slow, deliberate, like an old habit returning in unfamiliar form. Walter didn't hear the shout until it was too late. The grocer had installed mirrors recently, new, shiny, unblinking. There was no panic in Walter's face, no surprise. Just a kind of quiet resignation. The loaf remained tucked beneath his arm as he turned slowly. There was no run in his legs, no defense in his voice. Only a thin breath and the weight of a decision made in silence. The police came quickly. 2 officers. One older, with the practiced efficiency of too many cold calls. The other younger, still finding the rhythm of the badge. They found Walter standing exactly where the call said he'd be. Hands still at his sides. The loaf visible in his coat. His ID was old and worn, but it checked out. So did the dog tags. The older officer said little. The younger one lingered. He asked if the old man was really a vet. Walter nodded once. That was all. Handcuffs clicked shut with a kind of gentleness. The ride to the precinct was uneventful. Walter didn't speak. The bread sat on the front desk while he was processed. His name typed into a system that had long since forgotten him. The charge was petty theft. The crime, almost laughable. A loaf of bread for a man who had marched beneath foreign flags and returned home to vanish. He was given a holding cell for the night. Cold bench. Dim light. He slept lightly, not because he feared anything, but because years of training had rewired his rest. Even now, he awoke at the sound of keys turning. His court date was set for the next morning. A public defender, too busy to remember names, handed him a single sheet of paper and said he'd meet him at the courthouse. No one waited for him. No one called. No one knew that a storm had begged *N to gather inside the courtroom where he would stand the next day. A storm that had been waiting nearly 20 years to return. Morning in the Brooklyn Municipal Court began as it always did, slow, gray, and indifferent. Staff moved papers between desks with practiced detachment. Lawyers paced and whispered, eyes fixed on phones, waiting for cases that might matter. Outside, snow flurried along the courthouse steps, caught in gusts that bent flags and chapped faces. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered against cold tile floors. It was the kind of day where routine dulled everything it touched. Walter was brought in wearing the same layered coat and trousers he had been arrested in. The holding cell hadn't offered much warmth, and the morning's coffee had been watery and bitter. His hands were cuffed loosely, more as procedure than necessity. He shuffled along behind a bailiff, his steps slow, back slightly hunched. The courtroom didn't look at him as he entered. No eyes turned. No heads lifted. It was as if a shadow had passed through the door and taken a seat at the defendant's table. There were no family members in the gallery. No friends. No veterans advocates. Just court clerks, overworked attorneys, and a few journalists waiting for bigger stories to appear on the docket. Walter sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the table before him. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around. Only the quiet clink of his dog tags beneath his coat gave any sign of movement. When his case was called, there was a pause. A moment's delay, as if even the clerk had not expected the name to matter. But eventually, the monotone voice rang out through the courtroom. Case number 47293. State versus Walter Edward Grady. A young prosecutor, not long out of law school, stood and adjusted his tie. He looked at Walter only briefly before launching into the familiar rhythm of minor charges. The defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread from a local business. Surveillance footage and store owner testimony confirmed prior incidents. Given the defendant's transient status and history of similar offenses, the state recommends continued detention until trial. It was rote. Efficient. Stripped of humanity. A loaf of bread became a legal statistic. The man who took it became a case file. Judge Michael Carmichael flipped through the report. His expression was neutral, tired from a week of similar hearings. His bench was elevated, his presence large in a courtroom that had grown used to silence. He barely glanced at Walter as he read the name. The facts were familiar. Minor crime. Prior issues. No legal standing. No permanent address. Another small piece in a broken system. But then, something slowed. The judge's brow creased. His eyes narrowed at the file. The name. The birth date. A note handwritten in the margin, U.S. Army veteran, discharged 2004. The silence stretched longer than usual. The air seemed to shift slightly, like the stillness before a sudden gust. Judge Carmichael looked up. Walter remained seated, his expression calm, almost serene. No anger. No shame. Just a stillness that didn't belong in a place of punishment. His clothes were clean, if worn. His posture, even in age, held a certain discipline. And there was something else, something that stirred in the judge's memory like a photograph in fading light. Carmichael looked down at the file again. He turned a page. Then another. And there it was. Staff Sergeant Walter Edward Grady. Bronze Star. Multiple tours. Iraq. Afghanistan. Evacuation detail, 2003. Unit designation. Something inside the judge clenched. Without a word, he rose from the bench. The courtroom stopped moving. Pens paused. Screens dimmed. One of the stenographers looked up, confused. Judges didn't stand during arraignments. Not for petty theft. Not for shoplifters. And yet Carmichael stood tall behind the bench, jaw tight, hands clenched until his knuckles whitened. He looked straight at the bailiff. 15-minute recess, he said, his voice rough. No one dared speak. The judge turned sharply and walked out through the chamber doors, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. In his office, the door clicked shut behind him with finality. Carmichael moved quickly to the corner drawer of his desk, pulling it open with a practiced hand. From beneath files and folders, he removed a photograph, its edges bent, its surface faded by time. A military unit in desert fatigues. 20 men, squinting into sunlight, smiles half-formed, arms around each other's shoulders. Dust clung to everything. In the back row, tall and solid, stood a younger man with sharp eyes and a strong jaw. His name tag read Grady. Carmichael found himself in the same photo, shorter, younger, and standing near the front. He traced the faces with his finger until it landed on Grady's again. 20 years earlier, a supply run near Fallujah had gone wrong. Enemy fire tore through the convoy. Flames consumed the lead vehicle. In the chaos, a young medic had been trapped under debris, his leg crushed, blood soaking the sand. Carmichael had believed, in those minutes, that his life would end there, in a plume of fire and shouting. But it hadn't. Because Walter Grady had lifted him out. Carried him, limping and bleeding, across 2 miles of hostile ground. Shielded him from G** fire with nothing but his own body and a conviction forged in loyalty. Carmichael hadn't seen him again after that. The evacuation had split them apart. Medical leave had followed. Then law school. Then a career. And now, 20 years later, the man who had once carried him through hell sat alone in a courtroom, waiting to be judged for stealing a loaf of bread. Back in the courtroom, Walter waited. Still in his chair. Still silent. The prosecutor whispered something to the clerk. The bailiff fidgeted. No one quite knew what was happening. When Judge Carmichael returned, his face was unreadable, but something had changed. He took his seat slowly, rested his hands on the bench, and looked straight at Walter. Not the way a judge looks at a defendant, but the way a man looks at another man across a memory only they share. The room held its breath. And Walter, for the first time since entering the courtroom, met his eyes. There was no recognition. Not at first. But then, a flicker. A narrowing of the gaze. A pause in his breathing. As if some buried detail had floated back up through the years. A name once shouted over the roar of a battlefield. A promise once kept in fire. It was him. And something unseen began to turn. The courtroom seemed frozen in place. Even the air had thickened, as if it, too, recognized that something sacred had re-entered the room. The clerk stood, half-turned toward the judge, unsure whether to proceed. The prosecutor shifted his weight, glancing from Walter to the bench and back again. But Walter remained still, his shoulders quiet beneath the weight of unseen memories, his eyes steady on the man above him. Judge Carmichael inhaled slowly, then opened the file again, not because he needed to, but because rituals often give structure to things too large for words. His voice, when it came, was steady but laced with something different. Not pity. Not pity at all. Something heavier. He recited Walter's name again. Full and formal. Then read aloud the military record, each tour, each commendation, the Bronze Star citation in its dry, bureaucratic language that somehow carried the heat of battle within it. He read about the convoy ambush. About the burning truck. About the lives saved. And finally, he paused at the last line of the 2003 mission report. The actions of Staff Sergeant Grady directly saved the life of Private First Class Michael Carmichael. There was no sound in the courtroom. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, not in pride, but as if to nod toward someone long gone. The burden of memory did not leave him. But neither, in that moment, did it shame him. Judge Carmichael leaned forward slightly, hands clasped before him. He didn't look at the paper now. He looked at the man. He did not deliver a speech. There was no grand monologue, no sweeping pronouncement. He simply said that the charges were dismissed. That the court recognized the defendant's past service, his evident need, and the failure of systems that were supposed to protect men like him. He added that the record would be sealed, and that no further proceedings would follow. And then, in a voice not meant for the room, he said something only Walter heard. The gavel never fell. Walter stood slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. The bailiff, who had been unsure whether to approach, stepped back instead. There was no rush to leave, no scramble for freedom. Just a long moment of silence that carried more weight than any verdict ever could. As Walter walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, those who had once ignored him now watched. The prosecutor had lowered his eyes. The clerk's fingers hovered, unmoving, above the keyboard. Even the reporters remained still, sensing somehow that this wasn't their story to take. Outside the courthouse, the snow had stopped. The sky had softened to a pale gray, and the streets glistened with melting ice. Walter stood at the top of the steps, blinking against the brightness. He reached into his coat, pulled out the loaf of bread still wrapped in a plastic bag, and tucked it under his arm like something precious. A black SUV waited at the curb. It hadn't been there before. Judge Carmichael stood beside it, no robe, no escort. Just a man in a long coat, holding a folded piece of paper and an envelope. He offered both to Walter with no ceremony. The paper was a letter, typed and official, authorizing expedited access to housing, veteran services, and reinstated benefits. The envelope was smaller. It contained a single coin. Not currency, but a military challenge coin, metal, round, heavy in the palm. One side bore the insignia of the Army Medical Corps. The other was engraved with a phrase Walter had not heard in many years. Not forgotten. Carmichael did not stay long. He offered a single nod, then stepped into the SUV and was gone. Walter turned slowly, the coin in one hand, the bread in the other, and began walking, not in the direction of shelters or alleyways, but toward a quiet VA facility a few blocks away, where a caseworker named Elsie would soon receive a call to expect someone. Someone who had once saved lives but now needed saving. Word spread. First among the court staff. Then to reporters, who chose, uncharacteristically, to tell the story with care. A photo surfaced, scanned from an old yearbook of service, Walter in uniform, standing beside a supply truck, his face young and serious. The story ran in the Times 2 days later under a simple headline, "A Loaf of Bread and a Life Remembered." Veterans groups reached out. Donations arrived. A small apartment was found. Warm, simple, with windows that faced the morning sun. The fridge was stocked. A coat hung by the door, new but plain. And every Sunday, Walter sat at the park near Atlantic Avenue with a thermos of coffee and a book. Sometimes he spoke with others. Sometimes not. But always, on the bench beside him, was the coin, never pocketed, never forgotten. He never asked for attention, never accepted speeches or ceremonies. But the neighborhood changed. The bakery left a roll on the steps each night. The hardware store hired a second veteran. And kids, who used to walk past quickly, now stopped to ask questions. They didn't always understand the past, but they saw the kindness in his eyes. They heard it in his silence. And every time someone asked him if he was a soldier, Walter only smiled and shook his head. Not anymore. But I remember. Because sometimes, it's not the uniform that makes the hero. It's the weight they carry long after it's gone. And sometimes, the softest footsteps leave the loudest echo. Kindness without question is enough. Always.